Hi, I'm Amy Reyes with Rheumatology Network. At this year's annual meeting of the American College of Rheumatology, there were a number of studies presented on different treatments for lupus. It's an exciting time in lupus, says Dr. Richard Furie. He's chief of rheumatology at Northwell Health in New York. In today's one-on-one interview, he breaks down some of the studies presented at the meeting. Welcome, Dr. Furie, to Rheumatology Network. I appreciate your time today. It is Monday, and it is day 4 of the annual meeting of the American College of Rheumatology. You are the author of a number of exciting studies on lupus nephritis, and we're here today to talk to you about some of those presentations and your thoughts on studies on lupus nephritis and going forward in terms of new treatments. So welcome. Let's begin with highlighting some of the presentations that you and your team presented at the meeting this year.
Well, in lupus nephritis, we had the BLISS lupus nephritis trial that was with belimumab, and I can provide some details in a little bit about that study. And then there's a very exciting data, 2-year data coming out of the obinutuzumab study. And I actually presented the 1-year data last year at this meeting, but now we have 2-year data, and we can go into some details there and again a little bit. But it's an exciting time in lupus. We have struggled for, oh my gosh, 25 years. The foray into lupus and lupus nephritis trials started in the early 1990s. And the results of our efforts was just one drug, and that was belimumab, approved by the FDA about 10 years ago. And it's not for lack of trying, it's just been lupus is incredibly challenging for a lot of different reasons, and I could spend hours discussing those reasons. But we're finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel in systemic lupus and also lupus nephritis.
That's good to know. It has been a long haul. Like you said, it's just been one drug that's been successful in this area. So tell me about some of the trials that you presented.
Presented the BlissLN study, and that was with belimumab. Belimumab started development, oh my gosh, late 1990s. We did the phase 1 study back in the early 2000s, and there was very logical progression, and it ultimately led to 2 successful phase 3 studies and the approval of belimumab for extrarenal disease, and that occurred in March of 2011. So actually we're closing in on a 10-year anniversary soon. Now, what we did is to look at some of the patients who had renal disease in that study. Now, patients with very active lupus nephritis were not included. The study focused on extrarenal manifestations, but about 15% of the cohort actually had some low-grade renal disease. And there seemed to be, in this post-hoc analysis, evidence that those patients got better as far as their renal parameters. And there's some translational evidence that patients with lupus nephritis have the overproduction of BLISS, B lymphocyte stimulator, also known as BAFF. Anyway, so between translational science and a post-hoc analysis, it prompted the development of the BlissLN trial. And BlissLN was the largest lupus nephritis trial ever done, with well over 400 patients. And in order to get into that trial, patients had to have biopsy-proven lupus nephritis. But what was pretty unique was that they could come in with pure membranous nephropathy. That's usually not included in most lupus nephritis trials. Most lupus nephritis trials concentrate on patients with proliferative disease. In any event, there were a lot of patients entered into this trial. It was worldwide, and there were other unique features. The main unique feature is that it went for 2 years. Most lupus nephritis trials end at 1 year. This went for 2 years, which allowed not only to look at changes in disease activity over time, but look at the durability of the response and to concentrate on how many flares were occurring over time. There were a couple of other unique features. One is that there was a requirement for classification as a responder to reduce the prednisone dose to 10 milligrams or under by week 24. And another unique feature was that there had to be confirmation of the endpoint, because sometimes we'll see noise in these studies, but by requiring a confirmation, we would reduce the noise. Anyway, so those are some of the unique features. The primary endpoint was something called PERR, P-E-R-R, primary endpoint of renal response, and it was driven by a reduction in proteinuria, which is customary for lupus nephritis trials. But there was also protection against worsening kidney function. In the end, there was about a 11 percentage point difference between the performance of the drug versus placebo. And there were some secondary endpoints too. In fact, one of the secondary endpoints was complete renal response, was actually a little bit more rigorous than the primary endpoint. And that also had an effect size of about 10 percentage points. There was another secondary called time to renal related event. And that's where we get at the durability of response and the protection of this particular drug, belimumab, against flaring. And the hazard ratio for a composite endpoint, which was basically driven by worsening, was about 0.5. So meaning that there was a 50% reduction in the time to renal related event, which is terrific. And the ideal lupus nephritis trial would actually go on for, say, 50 years, and that obviously is impossible. But in this 2-year study, we showed that there was a reduction by 50% of worsening. So that's a very important lesson for real life. Anyway, this was a particularly history-making event because it's the first trial in lupus nephritis to be successful.
Mm-hmm. So what's next for this study? Because a 50% of reduction is a very big deal. Where do we go from here for you and your team?
Well, very practical. Next event is whether the FDA grants an extension to the belimumab label to be able to use this in patients with lupus kidney disease. Because again, the prior approval was for extrarenal disease and did not include patients like those that were entered into this particular study. Mm-hmm. So we will await that decision.
Mm-hmm. Well, we look forward to seeing that. Yeah. In terms of other studies your team presented, there were a few others, including one on, I think you call it OB for short.
Yeah. OB for short, yes, obinutuzumab.
Yeah.
So a little history here, and that goes back to, probably about 15 years ago with rituximab. Mm-hmm. Rituximab is a monoclonal antibody that depletes B cells, and we think B cells are central to the pathogenesis of lupus. And we were very confident when we did 2 studies in lupus, one in lupus and one in lupus nephritis with rituximab. And the shocker was that both studies failed. Now, when a study fails in lupus, you never really know. Is it the drug? Is it the clinical trial design? Or maybe it's the designers. And we really didn't think it was the drug or the strategy because we felt so strongly that B cells were key to lupus pathogenesis. There was a second trial done with a second generation B cell depleting agent, and that's called ocrelizumab. And that particular study was terminated prematurely, but the kind of results that we saw despite the premature termination were very similar to what we saw with the rituximab lupus nephritis trial. So the question was, do we persevere or do we give up on this whole strategy of depleting B cells? Well, along came obinutuzumab, and obinutuzumab was proven in the test tube, in vitro, to be a far more potent B cell depleting agent than its predecessors. And one of the feelings was that, well, maybe we failed in lupus with rituximab and ocrelizumab because there was insufficient B-cell depletion in the tissues. Anyway, in short, obinutuzumab is far more potent, and this was actually shown in clinical trials, basically head-to-head trials in B-cell malignancies. And the drug was approved in 2013 for chronic lymphocytic leukemia and later in lymphoma. So talking about perseverance, there was perseverance, and we went ahead and did a lupus nephritis trial with about 122 patients, randomized 1-to-1 to receive obinutuzumab, a far more potent B-cell depleter than its predecessors, versus placebo on top of standard of care, and standard of care meant mycophenolate. I presented the 1 year and 1.5 year results last year. At 1 year, the effect size was about 12 percentage points. At 1.5 years, actually it stepped up to 20 percentage points. And it's this year that we presented the 2-year data. And the 2-year data were somewhat similar to the 1.5 year data with an effect size of 19 percentage points. But what's so remarkable, the effect was durable, meaning the 2-year results are 1.5 years after the last receipt of drug. And we really didn't see any safety issues with this particular drug. We deal with effect sizes in all these studies, and to see an effect size of 20% for lupus, especially lupus nephritis, is very meaningful. So that was a phase 2 study, and just starting now is a phase 3 study with obinutuzumab. So I think this drug also holds a lot of promise, and it speaks to the importance of B cells, just like belimumab in lupus nephritis does.
How long has this drug been in circulation? If it is that effective in lupus nephritis and it has a history in treating, I think you said lymphoma and other B-cell related conditions, it's been around for a while, has it not? Or
yeah, that's a great question. I guess I was really hopeful that the phase 2 data would be looked upon favorably by the FDA, and that they might approve this drug without doing a phase 3 trial, because after all, there's a lot of safety data collected from the oncology experience.
Yeah.
And unfortunately it was not, and we had to do a phase 3 study, and it's not easy doing these studies in lupus nephritis. Takes a while, hard to find patients.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to the results of the phase 3 trials. It sounds exciting. Another good option for these patients that could come sometime in the future. Yeah.
Oh, there's a lot happening in lupus. It's about time. As I said, it's not for lack of trying, but it's been a major learning experience. I didn't talk about voclosporin. There was a presentation about voclosporin. That's a different approach to treating lupus nephritis, but their phase 3 study was successful as well, and I'm hopeful that that drug will get an approval for lupus nephritis. So it may be within 6 months or so that we could have 2 new drugs for lupus nephritis. As far as outside of lupus nephritis and just talking about extrarenal lupus, there's a lot happening there as well. One of the major players is anifrolumab, which affects yet a different pathway. It affects the interferon pathway. And there are a lot of presentations this year on anifrolumab, although the phase 3 studies, the 2 phase 3 studies were presented at last year's meeting. So we hope that 2021 might bring an approval for anifrolumab and make yet another drug available to our lupus patients. But what's interesting about lupus drug development is the, I call it the eclectic approach, and that is it's being attacked from many different angles. There are many different pathways that are involved, and there are several that are rising to the top. So it's just time will tell.
Well, it sounds like it was the year of lupus at ACR this year. Would that
Well,
be...
we hope every year is the year of lupus because we've lagged behind. Rheumatoid arthritis, I don't know how many drugs are approved,
Mhm.
uh, but it's probably around 15. And um, the spondyloarthropathies are doing quite well, and our brethren in Crohn's disease. So lupus has lagged behind, as has some of our other rheumatic diseases, but we are certainly making headway, and it's about time. We've been working at this for 25 years.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the work that you and your team do. I know that lupus patients really greatly appreciate this. I know it's a tough road for them, and having limited treatment options can't be a good thing. Um, where And that's it from Rheumatology Network. Back to you, Gina.